The rain was coming down hard, pounding against the windshield like a drum. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The wipers were working overtime, but they couldn't keep up. The road ahead was a blur of headlights and shadows. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:47 p.m. I was running out of time. I turned onto a quiet street, that kind of place where nothing ever happens. The houses were dark, the windows shuttered. Everyone was asleep, everyone but me. I pulled into the driveway of a small, unassuming house and killed the engine. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. I had to be careful. One wrong move, and it was over. I grabbed the duffel bag from the passenger seat and got out of the car. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, but I didn't care. I had a job to do. I walked up to the front door and knocked softly. A moment later, it opened and my twin brother Mike stood there looking just like me. Same face, same eyes, same everything. "You're late," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Traffic," I muttered, brushing past him. The house was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. Mike closed the door behind me and locked it. "You got everything?" he asked, eyeing the duffel bag. I nodded and set the bag down on the floor. "Yeah, it's all there." Mike crouched down and unzipped the bag, pulling out a stack of cash, a fake passport, and a plane ticket. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "You sure this gonna work?" he asked. "It has to," I said, my voice tight. "We don't have a choice." Mike nodded and stood up, shoving the items back into the bag. "All right, let's do this." It had all started a week ago. I'd been in trouble, big trouble. I owed a lot of money to some very dangerous people, and they weren't the kind to let a debt slide. I'd tried everything to come up with the cash, but nothing worked. I was desperate. That's when I came up with the plan. Mike and I had always been close. We'd grown up together, shared everything, but we'd also always been competitive. We'd spent our whole lives trying to outdo each other, trying to prove who was better, but this time I needed him. The plan was simple. I'd commit a crime, a big one, and Mike would provide the alibi. He'd be me, and I'd be him. It was the perfect plan. No one would ever suspect a thing. The crime was a bank robbery. I'd spent weeks planning it, studying the layout, the security, the routines of the employees. I knew exactly what to do. The night of the robbery, Mike and I switched places. He went to a bar downtown where he knew the bartender and a few regulars. He made sure to be seen to make a scene. He even got into a fight just to make sure people remembered him. Meanwhile, I was at the bank wearing a mask and holding a gun. It went off without a hitch. I got in, got the money, and got out. No one saw my face. No one knew it was me. But then things went wrong. I was back at Mike's house, counting the money when the doorbell rang. Mike went to answer it, and I stayed in the living room, out of sight. But when Mike didn't come back after a few minutes, I got nervous. I crept to the front door and peeked around the corner. Mike was lying on the floor, blood pooling around him. Standing over him was a man in a black hoodie, holding a knife. I froze, my heart pounding. The man looked up, and our eyes met. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and started toward me. I turned and ran, grabbing the duffel bag on my way out. I didn't look back. I just ran. Now I was back at Mike's house, standing in the living room, staring at his body. The man in the hoodie was gone, but I knew he'd be back. He knew who I was. He knew what I'd done. I had to get out of there. I had to disappear. I grabbed the duffel bag and headed for the door, but before I could open it, I heard a noise behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat. Mike was sitting up, blood dripping from his mouth, his eyes wide with fear. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I stared at him, my mind racing. He was alive, but for how long? I crouched down beside him, my hands shaking. "Mike, who was that? Who did this to you?" Mike coughed, blood bubbling up from his lips. It's not what you think, he gasped. They know everything. Who knows? I demanded, my voice rising. Mike, tell me. But before he could answer, his eyes rolled back, and he slumped to the floor, lifeless. I stood there, staring at his body, my mind reeling. What had he meant? Who knew? And what did they know? I didn't have time to think. I had to get out of there. I grabbed the duffel bag and ran out the door into the rain. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I drove away, my mind raced. Someone knew about the plan. Someone knew about the robbery, and now they were coming for me. But who? And why? The next few days were a blur. I stayed on the move, never staying in one place for too long. I used the cash from the robbery to buy food, gas, and a cheap motel room when I needed to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see the man in the hoodie, smiling that cold, cruel smile. Then one night, I got a call. I was in a motel room, staring at the TV but not really watching it, when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my heart pounding. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. "You're not as smart as you think you are," a voice said on the other end. It was deep, menacing, and sent a chill down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You'll find out soon enough," the voice said. "But first, you're gonna do something for me." "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "What do you want?" The voice chuckled, a low, dark sound that made my skin crawl. "I want you to finish what you started, and if you don't, well, let's just say you'll end up like your brother." The line went dead, and I sat there, staring at the phone, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, caught in a web of lies and deceit. Someone knew about the plan, and they were using it against me, but who and how? I thought about Mike, about what he'd said before he died. They know everything. What did that mean? Who were they? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I was in over my head, and the only way out was to keep running. But I couldn't run forever. Sooner or later they'd catch up to me, and when they did, I'd be ready. The rain hadn't stopped. It felt like it had been pouring for days, maybe weeks. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen the sun. It was like the weather knew what was happening, like it was trying to wash away the blood, the lies, the guilt. But it couldn't. Nothing could. I was holed up in another motel, this one even dingier than the last. The walls were thin, and I could hear the couple next door arguing about money. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the duffel bag on the floor. The money was still there, untouched. I hadn't even counted it. What was the point? It wasn't going to save me now. The phone call kept replaying in my head. That voice, cold, calm, and full of menace. "You're not as smart as you think you are." Who was it? Someone connected to the robbery? Someone who knew Mike? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone I hadn't even considered? I didn't know, and that scared me more than anything. I needed answers. I couldn't just sit here waiting for them to find me. I had to figure out who was behind this. I had to know why they'd killed Mike, and I had to know what they wanted from me. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. The rain was still coming down, but I didn't care. I had to move. I had to do something. I drove back to Mike's house, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. The streets were empty, the city quiet. It felt like I was the only one awake, the only one who knew what was really going on. When I got to Mike's house, I parked a block away and walked the rest. I didn't want to risk being seen. The last thing I needed was the cops showing up. The house was dark, just like I'd left it. The front door was still ajar. The wood splintered where the man in the hoodie had kicked it in. I pushed it open slowly, my heart pounding. The living room was a mess. The furniture was overturned, the carpet stained with blood. Mike's body was gone, but the blood was still there, dark and dried. I felt a lump in my throat as I stared at it. Mike was dead because of me, because of my stupid plan. I shook my head, forcing the thought away. I couldn't think about that now. I had to focus. I started searching the house, looking for anything that might give me a clue about who the man in the hoodie was or what he wanted. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to try. I found it in Mike's bedroom. Taped to the bottom of a drawer was a small black notebook. I pulled it out and flipped through it. The pages were filled with names, dates, and amounts of money. It looked like some kind of ledger, but it wasn't Mike's handwriting. I frowned, my mind racing. What was this, and why did Mike have it? I kept flipping through the pages, and then I saw it. My name, written in bold black letters. Next to it was a date, the day of the robbery, and an amount of money. A lot of money. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a ledger, it was a hit list, and my name was on it. I didn't know what to do. I felt like the walls were closing in on me, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Someone had been watching me, tracking me long before the robbery. And now, they were coming for me. I stuffed the notebook into my jacket and headed for the door. I had to get out of there. I had to think. But as I stepped outside, I saw him. The man in the hoodie. He was standing at the end of the driveway, his face hidden in the shadows. He was holding something. A gun. I froze, my heart pounding. He raised the gun and pointed it at me. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and cold. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted around the side of the house, my feet slipping on the wet grass. I heard the gun go off, the sound echoing in the night. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran through the backyard, jumped over the fence, and kept going. I didn't look back. I just ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the motel. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving. My clothes were soaked, my hands shaking. I felt like I was going to be sick. I pulled the notebook out of my jacket and stared at it. What was I supposed to do now? Who could I trust? I thought about calling the cops, but I knew that wouldn't end well. They'd ask too many questions, and I didn't have any answers. Not the kind they'd believe anyway. I thought about running, disappearing like I'd planned, but I knew that wouldn't work either. They'd find me. They always did. I was trapped, and I didn't know how to get out. The next morning, I got another call. This time, it was a text. A single address and a time. Midnight. Don't be late. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. I didn't know what to do. If I went, I was walking into a trap. If I didn't, they'd come for me. I didn't have a choice. At midnight, I was standing outside an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was still thick with moisture. I could hear the sound of the river nearby, the water rushing in the darkness. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The inside of the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "I'm here," I said, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard footsteps. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't the man in the hoodie. It was someone else, someone I knew. The figure stepped into the dim light, and I felt my stomach drop. It was Sarah, Mike's girlfriend. She looked different, harder, colder. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her eyes were sharp, calculating. She was holding a gun, and it was pointed right at me. "Sarah?" I said, my voice shaking. "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she motioned with the gun for me to move further into the warehouse. I hesitated, my mind racing. What was she doing here? What did she want? And where was the man in the hoodie? "Move," she said, her voice cold and steady. I did as she said, stepping further into the warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of rust and damp wood. I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the shadows. "Sarah, talk to me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's going on? Why are you doing this?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked over to a table in the corner and picked up a folder. She tossed it at my feet. "Open it," she said. I crouched down and picked up the folder, my hands trembling. Inside were photos of me, of Mike, of the bank. There were also documents, bank statements, and a list of names. My name was at the top. "What is this?" I asked, looking up at her. "Evidence," she said. "Proof that you and Mike were working together. Proof that you planned the robbery." I shook my head, my mind reeling. "No, that's not true. I didn't. Mike didn't." Save it, she snapped, cutting me off. I know everything. I've known for a long time. I stared at her, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. Mike told me everything. He told me about the plan, about the robbery, about the money. He told me you were going to double-cross him. That's not true, I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. I would never. Shut up, she screamed, her voice cracking. You killed him. You killed Mike. I froze, my blood running cold. What? No, I didn't. I would never hurt Mike. Then who did? She demanded, her voice rising. Who killed him, huh? Who else knew about the plan? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Sarah thought I'd killed Mike, but I hadn't. I would never. Sarah, listen to me, I said, my voice pleading. I didn't kill Mike, I swear. Someone else did. Someone who knew about the plan. Someone who's been watching us. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing. Who? I don't know, I admitted, but I'm trying to figure it out. That's why I'm here. That's why I came. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she lowered the gun just a little. Prove it. What? Prove you didn't kill Mike, she said, her voice tight. Prove it, or I swear I'll pull this trigger. I nodded, my mind racing. I had to think fast. I had to convince her. The notebook, I said, pulling it out of my jacket. I found it at Mike's house. It's a ledger. It has names, dates, amounts of money. My name's in it. So is Mike's, but it's not his handwriting. Someone else wrote it. Someone who's been tracking us. Sarah's eyes flicked to the notebook, then back to me. Let me see it. I handed it to her, my hands shaking. She flipped through the pages, her expression hardening with each one. Then she looked up at me, her eyes filled with rage. This doesn't prove anything, she said, her voice cold. It just proves you're lying. No, Sarah, please, I said, my voice breaking. I'm telling the truth. I didn't kill Mike, I swear. She stared at me for a long moment, her finger tightening on the trigger. Then suddenly she lowered the gun and turned away. Get out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What? Get out, she screamed, her voice echoing in the empty space. Before I changed my mind. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I was back at the motel, the door locked behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking. Sarah thought I'd killed Mike. She had proof, or at least she thought she did. But I hadn't. I would never. So who had? I thought about the man in the hoodie, about the phone calls, about the notebook. Someone was behind this. Someone who knew about the plan, about the robbery, about Mike and me. But who? And why? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I was running out of time, and if I didn't figure it out soon, I'd be next. The motel room felt like a prison. The walls were closing in, the air thick with tension. I couldn't sit still. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the mess I was in. Sarah thought I'd killed Mike. The man in the hoodie was still out there, and now there was this notebook, a ledger filled with names, dates, and amounts of money. My name was in it. Mike's too. But whose handwriting was it? Who was pulling the strings? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I grabbed the notebook and flipped through it again, looking for anything I might have missed. The names were unfamiliar, but the amounts of money were staggering. Thousands, hundreds of thousands. What was this? A blackmail list? A hit list? Then I saw it. A name I recognized. Detective Carl Harris. My stomach dropped. Carl Harris was the lead detective on the bank robbery case. He'd been all over the news, promising to catch the culprits. Why was his name in this notebook? And why was there a date next to it? 2 days after the robbery. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing. I had to talk to him. I waited until nightfall, then drove to Carl Harris's house. It was a modest place in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place you'd expect a cop to live. I parked a block away and walked the rest, keeping to the shadows. The house was dark, but I could see a light on in the back. I crept around the side, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was going to say or do. I just knew I had to confront him. I peeked through the window and saw him sitting at a desk, staring at a computer screen. He looked tired, his face drawn, his hair disheveled. On the desk in front of him was a stack of files. Case files, maybe. Or something else. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Carl Harris opened the door, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "Who are you?" he demanded. I'm Mike's brother," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to talk to you." His expression hardened. "Mike who?" "Mike Carter," I said. "The guy who was killed a few days ago. You're working the case, right?" He stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." I followed him into the house, my heart pounding. The living room was cluttered, papers and files scattered everywhere. It looked like he'd been working non-stop. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold. I pulled out the notebook and handed it to him. "I found this at Mike's house. Your name's in it." He took the notebook and flipped through it, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you get this?" "I told you," I said. "At Mike's house. Someone's been tracking us. Someone who knew about the robbery. Someone who killed Mike." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he set the notebook down on the desk and turned to me. "You're in over your head, kid." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice rising. "What's going on?" He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You and your brother. You thought you were so smart, didn't you? Thought you could pull off the perfect crime, but you didn't know who you were messing with." "Who?" I demanded. "Who are we messing with?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. He tossed it on the desk in front of me. "Take a look." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. Inside were photos of me, of Mike, of the bank. There were also documents, bank statements, and a list of names. My name was at the top. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Evidence," he said. "Proof that you and Mike were working together. Proof that you planned the robbery." I shook my head, my mind reeling. "No, that's not true. I didn't. Mike didn't." "Save it," he snapped, cutting me off. "I know everything. I've known for a long time." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "You and your brother, you were just pawns. You thought you were playing the game, but you were being played." "By who?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Who's behind this?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He handed it to me. "Call this number." I took the phone, my hands shaking. "Who am I calling?" "Just call it," he said, his voice cold. I dialed the number and held the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, then someone picked up. "Hello," a voice said on the other end. It was deep, menacing, and sent a chill down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "You'll find out soon enough," the voice said. "But first, you're gonna do something for me." "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "What do you want?" The voice chuckled, a low, dark sound that made my skin crawl. "I want you to finish what you started. And if you don't, well, let's just say you'll end up like your brother." The line went dead, and I sat there, staring at the phone, my mind racing. I left Harris's house, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust. All I knew was that I was in way over my head. I drove back to the motel, my hands gripping the wheels so tight they hurt. The streets were empty, the city quiet. It felt like I was the only one awake, the only one who knew what was really going on. When I got to the motel, I locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. My phone buzzed and I jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. The text is written as Midnight, Pier 7, come alone. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. I didn't know what to do. If I went, I was walking into a trap. If I didn't, they'd come for me. I didn't have a choice. The docks reeked of salt water and rust. Waves slapped against rotting wooden pillars, and fog clung to the air like a shroud. I stood under a flickering street lamp, the duffel bag heavy in my grip. The text had ordered me here. Midnight. Pier 7, come alone. A shadow moved. Victor Cray, Nick's slick-mouthed business partner, stepped out of the fog. His tailored suit looked out of place among the cargo crates, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Jack," he said, lighting a cigar. The flame briefly illuminated a jagged scar on his neck. "You've got guts showing up." "Where's Nick?" I demanded. "He's supposed to be dead." Victor chuckled, smoke curling from his lips. "Nick's very alive, and pissed. You and your brother botched his little side hustle." "What side hustle?" He flicked ash into the water. That diner wasn't flipping burgers, kid. It laundered cash for some very nasty people. Nick's cut, millions. Then you two morons robbed the wrong bank, his bank. My blood turned cold. We didn't know. Ignorance isn't a defense, Victor snapped. He tossed a photo at my feet. Mike's body, crumpled in an alley. Nick wanted you both dead, but I convinced him you're more useful alive. For now. Useful how? Victor's phone buzzed. He answered, his eyes never leaving mine. Yeah, he's here. A pause. Understood. He held the phone out to me. Someone wants a word. The voice on the line was metallic, distorted. You've got one chance, Jack. Blow up the evidence locker at the 12th precinct. Do it, and you walk. Refuse, and you'll never see her again. A muffled scream echoed, Sarah's voice. Don't, I shouted. I'll do it. Just let her go. The line died. Victor smirked. Midnight tomorrow. Don't be late. Sirens wailed in the distance. Victor vanished into the fog as cop cars skidded onto the pier. Detective Harris stepped out, his badge gleaming. Hands where I can see him, Jack, he ordered. Harris, listen, Nick's alive. He's framing us. Harris nodded solemnly, then pulled my gun from his coat, the one I'd lost at Mike's house. Funny. This was found at a murder scene. Your prints are all over it. The cops tackled me, cuffs biting into my wrists. Harris leaned down, his whisper ice cold. You should have run when you had the chance. As they shoved me into the squad car, I glimpsed Victor watching from a black sedan. Behind the wheel, Sarah alive, her smile venomous. The squad car door slammed shut, trapping me in the stench of sweat and stale coffee. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched Sarah's black sedan disappear into the fog. Her venomous smile burned into my mind. The phone in my pocket buzzed. The burner phone Victor gave me. I answered, hands shaking. Enjoy the show? The voice was distorted, robotic, but I'd recognize that smug tone anywhere. Detective Harris. You set me up, I hissed. You and Sarah, you're working together. He laughed, cold and crisp now, dropping the fake voice. Sarah's good, isn't she? Cried real tears at Mike's funeral. Even I almost believed her. The car hit a pothole, jostling me against the door. Harris kept talking, relishing every word. See, Nick's diner was laundering cash for the Balkan cartel. When you idiots robbed it, they thought Nick stole from them. So he made a deal. Give them your heads or lose his. And you? I spat. I get a cut. Always have. The car slowed outside the precinct. Oh, and Jack? That evidence in your bag? It's enough to put you away for 3 lifetimes, but don't worry, you won't live that long. The line died as cops yanked me out. Harris stood at the precinct steps, holding an evidence bag. My gun, Mike's ledger, photos of the robbery. Found these in his motel room, Harris announced, playing hero. Case closed. The headlines screamed, Drifter confesses to diner murder, kills self in cell. The article claimed Jack scribbled a confession. I killed Mike for the money. It was pure bullshit, but no one questioned it. That night, Harris met Sarah at the docks. Victor's yacht loomed behind them, engines humming. Clean work, Victor said, handing Harris a briefcase. The Balkans are satisfied. Sarah lit a cigarette, her red lipstick glinting in the moonlight. Shame about Jack. He was almost sweet. Harris counted the cash, sweet enough to take the fall. As the yacht sailed into the dark, a new diner opened uptown. Cash only, no cameras. Somewhere a phone rang.